I'm Steve Latham from the Yale Interdisciplinary Center for Bioethics, and I'm speaking today with Agata Bloswick. Agata, tell us a little bit about your educational background and your career.
I studied chemistry. I'm a Master of Science in Chemistry. I studied in Poland, and ever since I graduated, I began working for clinical trials in the pharmaceutical industry. And I've been doing that ever since for the last 12 years. And now I'm also working on my PhD in informed consent, how to make them better in clinical trials.
And where are you working on the PhD?
At Jagiellonia University.
Okay, and also in Poland, yes.
That's correct.
So you've been working clinical trials for how long?
12 years.
And I was just hearing a very large number, the number of countries in which you've done clinical trials.
That's correct. I've done more than 30 trials in more than 40 countries.
What kinds of things are the trials? What they're drugs for what kinds of illnesses?
Mainly trial on drugs, obviously, not medical devices, because that's a different specialization. And I have done vaccine trials, both pediatric, pandemic vaccinations, or regular influenza vaccination, seasonal, for instance. I have done also cardiovascular diseases, also in emergency setting, also all kinds of rheumatology trials.
And you were saying pretty much all around the world, except not in Africa.
Except not in Africa. We've had one trial almost started in South Africa, but then we didn't really need to activate the country.
Yeah. And how do you fit in doing the PhD with working on these trials all around the world?
Well, I do those in parallel. So I basically draw from my personal experience working in that industry, and my companies have usually been very open about it. They were happy that somebody's trying to make improvements to what we do on a daily basis. And then also my professor is very understanding, that knowing that I cannot have a full-time PhD because then I wouldn't have access to real life experiences and real life data. So this is why we've agreed to merge those two together.
Mm-hmm. So in our summer institute, of course, you're teaching research ethics. Yeah?
That's correct.
What kinds of things do you cover in that class?
So we talked about the basic history of how did we get where we are in terms of our legal framework. That we talked about informed consent and informed consent forms, obviously my favorite topic. We talk also about the vaccination trials, the vaccination, anti-vaccination movements. We will cover also therapeutic misconception, so the idea that patients not necessarily may benefit from the participation in clinical trial, but they usually think they will. Mm-hmm. So that's a relatively new concept in bioethics that has only been around since early 2000s in the practice of clinical trials. We also talk about vulnerable populations, placebo trials, all kinds of things that really are very practical. I bring case studies from my work, my daily challenges that I have. Some of those we were able to resolve, some of them we chose the easiest path, but not always everything is as simple in real life as it is in books. So I think this is what I bring to that class.
Mm-hmm. And what are the different, do you try to teach the students about the different legal regimes around the world?
Yes, so we basically start with where we are in terms of what are the global trials. I also talk a little bit about the specific country regulations, because obviously every country has their own regulation. We have the overarching guidelines. We talk about specific examples of what's different in the countries. A lot of students were very shocked about different compositions of IRBs or ethics committees in the various countries. In Poland, for instance, we had a priest on the ethics committee. So somebody was very shocked, saying, well, why not ethicist? Well, because that's usually what the Catholic country as Poland would consider as the ethical person. The ethical mm-hmm. specialist would be a priest. So various cultural specific, country specific things that I can talk about.
Mm-hmm. So and the students, of course, come from all around the world, so they're probably glad that you have such an international perspective on this, right?
Yes, they come and ask a lot of questions also about their countries. They come with their perception of what research is. Some of the students are obviously medical students, pharmacy students, so they have a little understanding about what are clinical trials, what is research on humans per se, but some of them really have no idea because they come from the humanities and they want to learn a little bit more. And during the first class I asked how many of you would participate in a clinical trial, and I think I had 1 or 2 people raise their hands. But as we go through that, they really see that this is a normal thing that happens every day, that this is the only way to bring new therapies to patients, that this is the way we have to do it, and we have to find the best way, the most ethical way to conduct clinical trials.
So in the US, we oversee social and behavioral research using the same kinds of review bodies and the same regulations that we use for a drug trial or for a trial of a new surgical intervention. Is that a common pattern around the world or not?
It is. So in the US, it would be typically IRBs reviewing, they would be more specialized, while for instance, I belonging to Jagiellonian University, to do my research on informed consent on potential participants, I also had to have my project, which is sociology projects, approved by the IRB, and that would be the same IRB that reviews clinical trials. So sometimes they were very confused when I was talking about informed consent for my study participants who will be reading informed consents as a part of my research, because it was a multi-level discussion that we had there. So it was the same body, the same regulation, and I would have to still submit my CV, my protocol for the research, statistical analysis, all of the same elements, just of course not the drug itself.
Right. So how does informed consent need to be improved?
So right now it's definitely too long, and it's definitely written in a way that you can say companies are protected, doctors are protected, and potentially we can say, well, patient read it, signed it, so he should be protected. But as my research showed, it's way too long. It's currently an average of more than 21 pages. It typically doesn't have any visual aids, no colors, no flowcharts, no pictures, so it's just plain text, 21 pages. So I really think that especially elderly patients, because they typically don't differ for the elderly population, will have trouble understanding it. And just my recent research that I just finished, sent a publication to be published last week, proven that patients don't understand what they read. When we asked about risks, what did they understand, what did they remember, to list the risks or list the procedures that they will be undergoing, they didn't understand what they read, they couldn't recall the risks. Elderly patients were able to recall 10% or 5% of the risks that were mentioned in the document. So then can you really say that informed consent served its purpose of informing the patient?
Yeah, and it is kind of amazing how seldom you see really creative informed consent procedures. That you can go online and see, for example, videos made by industry about how a device works, with beautiful CGI illustrated video of how the device is implanted and then what it does when it's inside your body, and it's all very clear and very visual, and you never see that in research trials. And you seldom even see basic things like asking people to talk back or asking people questions about what you've talked to them about.
Exactly. So I have been also investigating the e-consent, which is a new concept. Mm-hmm. We will have a tablet. We will show that tablet to the potential participant, and he can click on certain words when he is not sure what they mean. We could have videos. We could have the tablet talk back to the patient. All that is a great idea, but if you do a global trial where you need to translate that into 30 different languages to make sure you submit that to the ethics committee before you can start the trial, it becomes very expensive, and it becomes very lengthy, which further delays potentially getting the drug to the market, increases the price of doing the clinical trial as well, because until we build the database of all of those videos and all of the stories that we can tell, then each time we have to customize it to your product, which makes it significantly more expensive.
Is anybody starting to do that?
Yes, so there are some trials, especially in the smaller trials, when there's like one country or two countries, or it's US, UK, Canada, for instance, and you can get away with 2 or 3 languages. That's much easier to do than in large global trials. And then we run into questions like, well, at the end of the day, when we inform patient with the tablet, we still have to sign a paper, and what's in that paper has to match what's in that tablet. So in the end, the document for signature is still lengthy. Only a few countries actually allow e-signature that is fully validated, and it's equal to a handwritten signature. So there's a lot of layers of challenges that we can have with the e-consent. Similarly with the video, even if we inform through the video, we still have to sign something, and that something has to match what was in that video. So I think there's a lot of layers, a lot of difficulty with that topic, and we all know that informed consent is a process, so there is also that doctor-patient interaction that is really important. But the form itself, at the end of the day, patient takes home the form, the document to which he has to be able to refer back, to read it, to remind himself how many times a day he needs to take a drug, how many times a month he needs to go and see the doctor. All the things are in the informed consent, which should be more informative.
Yeah. In your class, do you talk about payment to subjects? Or do you talk about fair benefits kinds of issues, about payments to, say, whole communities that have made people available for study?
We talk a little bit about this in the vulnerable population discussion. I mean, there's a lot of trials that address groups of patients that otherwise wouldn't participate in a trial if they weren't vulnerable. So if we talk about, I had a case study like that. We were running a trial that was supposed to be for patients that were relatively treatment naive. And we needed 30% of patients to come from the United States. And the standard therapy was a golden standard, almost available for everybody. So how do you find treatment-naive patients in the United States? So obviously the group of patients we needed to address that to were the uninsured or the underinsured. The uninsured sometimes could get a free therapy from the pharmaceutical companies. And then if they did, one dose was enough to exclude them from the trial. So we really needed to go for that middle ground of the underinsured patients, which obviously caused some ethical challenges because you specifically address a group of patients that otherwise wouldn't be able to get access to that medication. So we talk about things like that. We talk about running trials in the Eastern Bloc, former Soviet Union, where after the drug is registered, quite possibly will not be reimbursed. So that means they will not have access to that medication, or they could have the access, but they wouldn't be able to afford it. But at the same time, is it ethical to not give them the chance of getting that treatment for 2-3 years if it proves efficient for them? Maybe that's the ethical way to go.
Do most companies have a compassionate use program or something through which they would continue to give drugs to the people who were involved in a trial if a drug turns out to be successful?
It's also a very challenging discussion, of course, because some countries like Brazil typically mandate that. So doing trials in Brazil becomes much more riskier because you have to then make sure that you provide that compassionate use for patients. But it also provides additional risks to the patients because the drug, we have to understand, is not approved. So if it's not approved, we don't know if it's safe and efficacious. So companies put themselves up for liability if they provide that compassionate use, because what if the drug proves to be not safe or not efficacious? And then if we run the study, we have a protocol, we have clearly defined endpoints, we have regular visits, somebody's monitoring that. If we take all of that safety net and provide the drug after the trial's over, then nobody's monitoring it to the same extent. So I think there's a lot of pros and cons to that, and this is what we discuss in classroom. I mean, there's no easy way. We just have to always negotiate on a case-by-case what's the best way to go.
Excellent. So what do you enjoy about teaching the summer program? You've done it a couple times now.
What I love about it is that we don't have people coming from the same background, from the same subject. So if it was a classroom full of doctors or pharmacists, it would be boring. We have lawyers, we have sociologists, anthropologists, we have people coming from various countries. Each of them has their experiences, their concepts, their solutions. And I think that's what's the best about this, is that sometimes we talk about something, everybody agrees, and then I ask the same question a little bit differently, and somebody comes up with a different answer. I think that's really interesting when we talked about the mandatory vaccinations. Should they be mandatory or not? They are mandatory in many countries, so people came with their experiences, how to best do that, why is it important? And some other people try to say, well, maybe let's not make them mandatory, and kind of try to relate to their own experiences of having 99% of their friends and relatives being vaccinated, that a reasonable discussion makes people want to do the right thing. But then some other people come with other experiences where the whole governments decide, well, vaccines may not be safe, and they kind of go into that level of discussion. So I think there's a lot of communication going on very different fields, not just interculturally, but inter subject matter experts, let's say.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for teaching that class, and thanks for sitting for this little interview.
Thank you.
Thanks.